Good morning. I want to thank MSPWin, Brian, Nikema, all the others that I had the opportunity of meeting last night, and other members of the board for inviting me here today to speak at this event. I have to say from the beginning that I am just totally amazed and taken aback by the attendance here today. And I think that says a lot about how seriously Minneapolis-St. Paul is taking employment disparities. So I think that this is an excellent opportunity to be able to really engage some of the issues that have contributed to the persistence of these gaps and really begin to have a meaningful conversation. I echo what Nikema has said already about the feeling that in my generation, I feel like this is my opportunity to take the baton in what really is a multi-generational relay in the fight for economic justice. My parents grew up during a time where they remember the Jim Crow South and having to use segregated facilities. That was something that I did not have to experience or encounter in my lifetime, and they were able to provide a lot of great opportunities for me and my siblings. And so for me, it's not just a matter of taking those things for granted, but really appreciating the sacrifice and the struggle that happened in the generations before me, and utilizing what is in my hands and my power to do to continue to make progress in this area. So these are issues that are very personal to me. I'm very passionate about these issues, and it really is an honor and a privilege to have an opportunity to speak to a group who's interested in hearing what I have to say about this. We don't typically get sold out rooms when we talk about employment disparities or any sort of racial disparity. So this is really great, and I think there's really a great energy in this room today. I'm also very aware that my predecessor at EPI, Algernon Austin, is a great friend of many of you, and that you have, as has already been done today, referenced his work and utilized really the foundation that he has set in place for this kind of discussion. And so I look forward to hopefully taking that the next step. I realize those are big shoes to fill, so I'm going to do my best today. I think that generally speaking, there really is a movement underfoot for making some progress on issues related to racial disparities. And I think a lot of that is motivated and driven by the fact that across the country we recognize that our population is changing. And this really is the opportunity to seize the moment and do something so that our future looks different than our past has. This is also a time when there's a great amount of frustration with Washington, D.C., and what's often referenced as Washington gridlock, the inability to get anything done legislatively. And so the mantle of change really is being taken up at the state and local level, and people are running with it and making changes. I think probably one of the most prominent recent examples is what's been done in Seattle with the minimum wage. The federal government has been dragging their feet on really getting a minimum wage bill to the floor that they could vote on. And Seattle has taken a bold approach and really going beyond what anybody has proposed and saying the minimum wage should be $15 an hour. That's a living wage. That's a wage that will allow people to support themselves and their families. And so I think, the opportunity for bold approaches really do begin at the local level. So the question I would raise today is, why can't that begin here in Minneapolis-St. Paul when we talk about employment disparities? There's really an opportunity to make a bold move, take some bold steps. And I recognize that doing that is not easy. It begins with having some frank and honest discussion about the factors that influence racial disparities that continue to persist, despite the fact that we have legally desegregated many facets of our community. We have anti-discrimination laws on the books. Educational attainment has advanced tremendously for communities of color, African Americans in particular, over the last 50 years, but we still haven't seen that same level of progress when we think about or when we observe economic outcomes. And so there are clearly some things, some tangible, some intangible, that are at play in perpetuating those disparities, despite the fact that, at least on the legal side of things, ideally, theoretically, discrimination has been wiped off the books. So there are some serious conversations to have, and understanding that racial economic disparities in this country really have deep historical roots that are based in a power structure that was set up to pre-assign who would be winners and who would be losers. And that sort of structure persists today. It was imposed in different ways and at different times through our legal, social, and economic policy. Some of those much more overtly racist than others. More today, what we see probably is more subtle things. And I think this sort of framework is in our collective subconscious in ways that many of us may not be aware of, or that we just frankly do not want to acknowledge. So I realize that in having these discussions, there are tangible things we can talk about, that we can identify clearly, and we can say these are targets to work toward. But then there are also some of the more deeply ingrained ways of thinking about race that really are more of a more complicated process. So I think that there are two ways of doing things. I don't think that there's a choice to make between having some specific and direct actions and continuing conversations, because I think it's the conversations that really do a lot to change the way and shift the way that we think about race and that we think about people's ability to do various things. Now, for the purpose of setting realistic expectations at the beginning, before I get into some of my slides, I am not going to address every single one of those problems in the 45 minutes that I have here today. One, I don't have the time. Two, I'm under no delusions that I have all the answers either. But what I would like to do, my objective here today, is to put some of these underlying issues on the table, at least as it relates to some of the tangible things, as a way of identifying potential targets and levers that we can begin to structure programs and policies around. And then to share some of those strategies and policies, some ideas that I think could probably be taken up and tailored to the specific politics and circumstances facing communities of color in this region. So if that's fair, that's how I plan to proceed for this morning. And I hope you will go along with me on this journey. So at the beginning, I think it's important to be clear and really set the stage for what we're talking about when we say unemployment disparities, employment gaps, however you want to say it. So I want to define employment disparities in two realms, really. The first being just the very basic access to the labor market, the ability to get a job to begin with. But there's a second piece of that that's equally important when we think about the influence on other types of economic outcomes, and that's related to the quality of jobs that people have access to. This means anything from wages, benefits, hours, working conditions, and opportunities for advancement on the job. So employment disparities can play out first in access to a job, getting any job, but then also in the kind of jobs that people have access to. And in nearly every circumstance when we talk about disparities, we're talking about, on average, less labor market access or lower quality of jobs for people of color relative to whites. So that's typically the way that these disparities play out. And I would argue that addressing employment disparities is critical to our overall economy, and really critical to addressing any other kind of economic issue that you would want to tackle, be it poverty, be it income inequality, that has gotten lots of attention recently, even internationally, with Thomas Piketty's work. But addressing any of those things, I think, really starts with looking at this employment issue. And that's because the primary way that most people without inherited wealth get the resources to provide for their basic living expenses and save for the future is through the money that they earn on a job. I think that's true for the majority of people, regardless of race or ethnicity, but it's especially true for people of color who typically have lower levels of wealth, even when they have equal income. So really, I think employment disparities are at the heart of a lot of the other economic disparities that we see playing out along racial lines. And so my first slide is just sort of a summary of what brings me here today. These are a couple tables from some of the work that Algernon did in looking at unemployment disparities. And as has already been pointed out today, this research showed that the state of Minnesota topped the list relative to other states in this country, but also this particular metro area topped the list of large metro areas when we think about black-white unemployment disparities in particular. Now, this research was focused specifically on black-white unemployment disparities. And unemployment is one way of getting at the extent of these disparities, but another way of looking at it would be to look at technically what's called the employment population ratio, which is basically just the percentage of working age adults that have a job. The difference between this and the unemployment rate is that, as some of you may know, the unemployment rate, people only count it as unemployed if they are actively seeking a job. So if they've looked for a job in the last month. If you've become discouraged and stopped looking, you're not even counted as unemployed, although you don't have a job. So really the employment population ratio, or what I'll be referring to simply as the employment rate, is a broader way of looking at the extent of joblessness. And so what these tables show, and I utilized Minnesota Compass data, that was very useful in my preparing for this talk today. What this shows is that it's not just an issue when we think about black-white gaps. When we look across the board at other groups, Minnesota is near the bottom for basically every other major racial or ethnic group in the state. So there's a white Asian employment gap that's about 10.7 percentage points. Those are actually points. Hispanic white unemployment rate, that's 6.7. I forgot about my nifty pointer. 6.7 percentage points. And then the American Indian or Native American white employment gap, that's at 26 points. It's actually the largest among the groups. Now, something else that stood out to me in comparing these tables is that Minnesota is near the bottom, but it's not necessarily on its own. You know, you can see it's not at the bottom of every list. But then, you know, there's also sort of and this is relative to just other Midwestern states, the states sort of cluster. So if we look at the black-white table, 46, 48, 49, 50. You know, that's sort of a cluster of states with a similar type of disparity. It varies a bit for different groups in terms of the magnitude of the disparities and where the states rank, how high a state may rank on any given list. But this isn't an issue, again, that's unique to Minneapolis-St. Paul. It's not an issue that's unique to Minnesota. The other thing to note is that disparities in the Twin Cities in particular mirror sort of what we see at the state level, both in terms of the magnitude of the gaps, but also the order of the gaps. So again, we see the white American Indian gap being the largest, followed by the black-white gap or white-black gap, the gap for Asian Americans, and then the gap for Latinos being the smallest. And I'll want to reference this again when I get to some of my later slides and looking at some of these underlying factors that may be influencing this gap. But again, this is out of 25 large metro areas, and these were the rankings for each respective group. On the bottom is the actual employment rates of those groups. So again, it was highest for whites, followed by Latinos, Asians, Blacks, and then American Indians. Now, in looking at the population of Minnesota and the Twin Cities, Minnesota, I'll start with the state level, is relatively less diverse than surrounding states. And as you would typically see in any state, the communities of color tend to be concentrated in urban areas. So you see a much larger percentage of persons of color in the city than would be at the average in the state. But despite the fact that you may be able to characterize Minnesota as being less racially diverse than some other surrounding states, one of the things that I found interesting is that among communities of color, there's a fairly even distribution of the population. The exception being American Indians. They're a much smaller group. I think you'd find that again in nearly any city or any state that you would look at. But I think that makes the Twin Cities, and it makes Minnesota fairly unique. When I compared it to other states in the region, to a large degree, there were states where, for example, African Americans are clearly the majority of people of color. That was the case in Illinois, Michigan, even in Missouri. But again, here, you tend to find a more even distribution. And I think that is important, one, in terms of thinking about strategies of building coalitions across groups. You know, no group is the clear dominant or majority group. So it really does create an atmosphere, at least suggest that there needs to be some collaborative working together to make conditions better for everyone in the area. But it also points to the fact that when we look at the overall gaps for communities of color, to the extent that the gap is larger, you can identify the group where those largest gaps are, and that really is where you need to make considerable progress. Just because, you know, the larger gap being in a group that has similar representation to other groups, if you want to reduce the overall gap, you're really going to have to hit hard at that particular population. But I also want to pause and sort of make a point that even though those opportunities exist to have collaboration across groups and working together collectively, when we look at the data and we think about strategies, it's important to look at them for specific racial and ethnic groups. It's important to note the differences across groups because there will be no one-size-fits-all policy. You know, issues that may be of concern in one particular community may not be that big of a factor when we think about how we want to close the gaps for another. And then as I showed earlier, the size of the gaps isn't even the same for all communities. So there'll be different things that we'll need to target. And I think part of the risk that you run in lumping all groups together is that it's easy to believe that you're making progress in closing gaps for people of color as a group when all or most of the gains may be concentrated for one particular group. And in order to close the gaps, we have to ask not only what drives racial disparities in the area, but how significant are these factors for the relative gaps experienced by different groups. And I think failure to do this sort of assessment really leads you to an incomplete solution to the problem, however well-intentioned that may be. The example that I like to use in thinking about a policy that was very well-intentioned, I think that most of us would agree it has been an effective policy, but it definitely had disparate outcomes. The level of effectiveness varied depending on the population you're talking about. And that particular policy is affirmative action. I think there's no question that it opened doors of opportunity in education, opened doors of opportunity in employment for minorities as well as for women. But I think it's also clear that the major beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women. That was because there were a lot of other factors contributing to lack of opportunity for people of color that were not present when it came to white women. And so that was a policy, again, that was a broad policy. It definitely had positive outcomes, but it had unequal outcomes because there were other factors at play that weren't addressed as comprehensively at the same time. And another interesting thing that's sort of going on now with the fight for affirmative action is that challenges to that policy typically tend to be focused on race. And so when people think about ways to mend it or to adjust it, they're thinking about ways to continue to have a racial focus without using race. One of the things that has been proposed is using poverty as a proxy for race. So set aside a certain amount of admissions for students who come from impoverished backgrounds. That would definitely disproportionately have an effect for communities of color. But what would be missing in that is the middle class, which many would argue still wouldn't necessarily have the same opportunities to gain access to a lot of institutions across the country were race taken out of the equation. So again, you'd have a policy that's well-intentioned, focused on something that would definitely have an impact, but you would clearly be leaving a group behind. So that's just an example of what can happen when we don't really try to target all the areas where there needs to be some intervention. So next I want to go through a series of slides that looks at some potential targets, some tangible things that we could potentially target for closing these gaps within each community. And so the first one is probably the most commonly cited, the most obvious example, and that is to look at disparities in educational attainment. This chart shows the percentage of the adult population with no post-secondary education. So that's people who have a high school diploma or less. They haven't attended any school beyond graduating from high school. And you see, again, across groups, that these numbers are quite different. And one thing that I hope jumps out at you immediately, given the previous slide that I showed and looking at the magnitude of those employment gaps for different racial groups, is that something doesn't seem to be quite right here. Before, and I showed the employment gaps, Latinos had the smallest employment gap. But on this slide, if education is the problem, they also had the lowest educational attainment. So clearly, that's not the only problem, the only solution to the problem. Native Americans and Blacks, who had the largest gaps, actually have a relatively higher degree of educational attainment than Latinos in this metro area. And I would say that this is a trend that's probably, that is what we observe nationally, as well as in a number of different states. And so what you're seeing here, the balance of that would be people who do have some education beyond high school, so whether it be a 2-year degree, 4-year degree, or beyond that. So clearly, education doesn't fix all those gaps. And I think the point was already made that even if you equalize education, employment disparities still persist, and especially Black-white employment disparities. And so One of the things that I think is useful, and this was a recommendation that I know that Algernon made as well, was that it's important to improve the skills of Black workers in particular. I'll use as the example. But organizations that provide training also need to do a lot of work to help connect people who have been well trained with employment opportunities, because training is just the first step. It's also important in that process, and I know that a lot of that is happening here in this city, that employers and training providers, educational partners, work together to identify the industries that are going to be high growth industries and make sure that communities of color have the training and the credentials to have access to those jobs. But again, it requires that connection between training and ultimate employment outcomes. And then another issue that typically plays out in cities across the country, again, is the role that unions play and sort of that tension between gaining access to apprenticeship programs, gaining access to the jobs that are, good paying jobs, provide great benefits, but a lot of communities of color still feel like they're locked out of that. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area in recognizing the fact, again, that the working class population will be what people call majority minority well before the overall population will be. So I think it's really in the best interest to begin to do more now to expand and increase opportunities that are available through unions. And then another strategy that I think tends to not get mentioned so much when we talk about workforce development and providing opportunity is the role of entrepreneurship in small business development. I think that in particular is an empowerment strategy and something that should be looked at more closely. Part of that is related to aggressively monitoring and enforcing existing contracting goals. Again, contracting goals have been on the books at the federal level, at the state level, local level for years. But typically, we find when people actually evaluate them is that those goals often are not met. And the idea is that there aren't businesses that, are qualified or in a position to be able to take advantage of that. Some of that may be true, but I think in addressing that issue, it's important to expand access to capital, which is a way that people can grow their businesses, increase and expand their workforce in ways that make them able to compete more effectively for those types of contracts. And depending on how much time we have at the beginning, I can talk about some of the specific policies that when in my time at the Urban League that we were advancing for expanding opportunities to lending, small business lending specifically. So the next slide looks at residential patterns or residential segregation and its effect on employment access. The measure used here is the dissimilarity index. Basically, what this number is telling you is a measure of residential segregation in metro areas. What that number tells you is that's the percentage of people from either group. So I take the white Hispanic set of bars here. That's the percentage of people who would need to move in order to have equal representation across the city. So the white Hispanic index for the Twin Cities is 42.5%. For blacks, 50.2%, and for Asians, 39.6%. The red bar, or I don't know what color is showing on that screen, maybe orange bar, is the national average for cities across the country. So relative to the national average, the Twin Cities area is relatively less segregated, at least for whites and Hispanics. It's about on par for Asians. The line, the horizontal line there, is a level that would be considered low segregation or a low level of segregation. So with that being said, I mean, it's not a low level, but it's lower than the national average. And this is important because of one of the main ways that people gain access to employment is through their informal networks. So that has a lot to do with the people that you physically come in contact with. And so, I mean, I think an easy thing to think about is ask yourself, would you rather live in a community where 80% of the people are people who could potentially help you connect to a job, or in a community where there's only 50% of the people who could help you connect with a job? And so I think addressing these sort of disparities maybe falls outside of the purview of workforce development. And I know desegregating communities is a much larger issue. But I think it's important to recognize the role that this plays in access to networks, and thinking about ways that networks can be created that helps to expand access to communities of color. Now, one caveat to this, and a point that I would like to make, is that one of the reasons why we see a smaller Hispanic-white gap is that there's been a lot of research that suggests that there are very effective networks within the Hispanic community. The thing about that is that those networks typically help people to gain access to lower quality jobs. So again, that's the second part of employment disparities that goes beyond the access. Some of the policies that I think would be important and effective in doing this, and a lot of these would be things that would need to be done at the federal level, would be really to have a full employment policy in this country. What that means is that every working adult who's willing and able to, desires having a job, would be able to get a job. Now, the main way that has been proposed of doing that is that the government then steps in as an employer when the private sector isn't providing enough jobs or hasn't created enough jobs to provide adequate employment. You talked about Humphreys. Years ago, there was the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act. That was like really sort of out there at that time, and maybe even now, because it involved the fact that if people couldn't get a job, they could actually sue the federal government for a job. I don't know that anybody would be willing to go to that length today, but that's a bold step in really making a statement that people should have a right to employment if they desire employment. So a broad-based policy like that, I think, is probably an effective way of helping to narrow the gaps. But beyond that, just the whole idea of a public sector employment program. That's also been done at other times in our nation's history. Probably not so popular today, given the focus on the budget and the deficit and the debt. The idea that we don't have the resources to do that sort of thing. I would argue that may or may not be the case. We spend money on a lot of things, and it's really just sort of a matter of setting employment as a priority. And so there are different ways that this could be done. Again, targeted in these communities where unemployment is especially high, targeted for people who are residents in those communities. So to sort of provide a practical example of this in a way that would expand employment opportunities and be of a benefit to the community. One of the proposals that EPI has talked about is the federal government should provide funds to local governments for job creation that's aimed at, again, improving quality of life in the community. With this federal funding, local communities could create projects along with community input. I think it's important to have the community involved in talking about some of these things. And that this may include anything from addressing physical infrastructure, rehabilitating and beautifying the housing stock, green spaces, et cetera. And then that these programs would be targeted, again, for local residents. There could be wage subsidies that pays a percentage of the wage for people who are hired to do these sorts of jobs, et cetera. So I think, again, those sorts of policies are maybe beyond the scope of something that could be done locally, but I think it requires an effort at all levels. Really, if you're going to close the gaps, it's going to require big changes. Another important issue is transportation. This shows that this is the percentage of people who commute to work using public transportation. Again, on here clearly, African Americans are more likely to utilize public transportation to get back and forth to work. I know I heard recently about the opening of the Green Line that's connecting the Twin Cities. So that's something I think probably is going to be positive for this area. But I think another thing that's important, beyond just connecting and providing people access, typically public transit jobs disproportionately benefit African Americans as a disproportionate representation in these jobs, especially for Black men, even though, again, within this sector, access to the higher paying jobs is typically a bit limited. So the final issue that I think is important to put on the table and to think about how you address and closing disparities is just the disparities even in incarceration rates. Again, this is a graph that no matter what city I put up here, you're going to see the same pattern. And this, has been the result of policies, social policies in this country that have disproportionately targeted people of color. The drug policy probably is the most common example when you think about, at one point there was a difference in sentencing for, was it an ounce of cocaine relative to crack cocaine? And so different things like that. And so when we think about how we can begin to address these disparities, one of the policies that I know Minnesota already has in place, other states are looking at, is ban the box. Don't ask people about their criminal history in the application process for a job. In our conversation last night, I heard that there are still challenges to that because even though it's not on a physical written form, people can still be asked about it and they answer the question, not knowing that they don't have to answer the question. But I think that even in not answering the question, that raises some barriers. So I think that there are some things that can be done to make that policy more more effective in thinking about incentives that you could offer employers to hire ex-offenders, whether that be, again, in the form of some sort of wage subsidy, whether that be some sort of tax credit, et cetera. That's already been done in looking at hiring people who have been unemployed for a long period of time or people from particular communities. So there's a precedent for that. And then there's also the significance of reintegration programs and helping people to make that transition once they've had some experience with the criminal justice system. That's the end of my graphic presentation. And as an economist, I have to show you some graphs. I think they'll probably take my PhD if I didn't use some graphs in my talk. So I checked that box. I'm good on that. But in closing, I want to just, I've talked a bit about some broad examples of policies, but I wanted to sort of talk about some specific policies. I was asked to share some examples of things that are working. And I have to say that that was probably the hardest part of preparing for this, because these employment disparities exist everywhere you look. The magnitude may be a little different, but they're still there. Nobody has solved the problem of eliminating employment disparities. And I think the interesting thing that you find, particularly with respect to the black-white gap, is that in the areas where you see a smaller gap, it's either because everybody's doing worse, so things equalize at the bottom, or you tend to see relatively better outcomes in cities where the government is a major employer. So again, the role of public sector employment should not be underestimated in helping to close some of these gaps. Now, with respect to the Latino-white gaps, there are actually some cities where the Latino unemployment rate is lower than the white unemployment rate. The thing I think is interesting about those cities is they typically tend to be in areas where that population is a relatively small share of the community. And then again, there's also that question of, well, what types of jobs are being held? So again, this is a complex issue. I told you I wasn't going to solve everything at the beginning, but in my search for some examples, I actually came up with a recommendation in the process of going through that. So I asked people who are involved in EPI's EARN network. That's a network of state and regional multi-issue research, policy, and advocacy organizations. I asked them, well, can you tell me about some things that are working well in your city? I got a few responses. A lot of those things were, again, sort of studying the gaps more than actually having examples of things that had been done to close the gaps. I did just some internet searching on my own to see what I could come up with, using things like closing employment gaps programs for closing unemployment gaps or racial disparities. And that was futile. I came up with very limited examples that way. And so I think the first suggestion is that I think it's a worthwhile venture to put some effort into really creating a catalog or database of programs based on things that you all know about that have worked. I think many of you in this room are familiar with some things that are being done in different locales that could potentially be replicated or you could take pieces of. So what I'm going to spend my last few minutes that are quickly ticking away talking about is some things that I personally know about from my experience at the National Urban League, as I think good examples of an empowerment model for helping people to gain access to employment. Again, these things don't close the gaps by any means, because I think the challenge in looking at any particular program is just that the scale of it is so small that it may have great outcomes for the group being served, but at the city level, you're not going to see the needle move very much. So there's always the challenge of bringing these sorts of things to scale. And so just very quickly, a couple programs that I wanted to highlight that were Urban League models that were successful in many of the communities where they were utilized. And again, it varies depending on the city. Every city is different. You have specific culture, politics in that region. But the Urban Youth Empowerment Program was a program, or is a program, funded by the Department of Labor. It engages at-risk and adjudicated youth for entry into the workforce through a comprehensive set of services. That includes case management, restorative justice, education, mentoring, internships, and on-the-job training. So there was really a suite of services made available to these young people. And they also provided other sorts of wraparound services like housing assistance, legal advice, and tax services. So in addition to improving vocational and educational skills, they also had a community service learning project component that helped students to give back to their communities. The idea was that, if you had committed some crime that was detrimental to the community, on the other side of that, as we prepare you to enter the workforce, we're going to engage you in doing something that sort of, provides a reparation for that, so to speak. This program targeted 18 to 24-year-olds, but it's been expanded for 14 to 17-year-olds. And signature programs, if you want to look at specific ways in which this program was implemented and some of the results, the signature programs were in Dallas, at the Dallas Urban League affiliate, Pittsburgh, and Essex County, New Jersey. So those are just some quick examples. We also did an evaluation of this program after the initial round, and showed some positive outcomes in terms of connecting people with employment, reduced recidivism, an increase in terms of people getting their GED, even enrolling in college. So that sort of model was effective in a number of locations. The other thing that I want to mention is the Entrepreneurship Center model. Again, this sort of takes a different approach to empowering communities in workforce development. The Entrepreneurship Centers provide management counseling, mentoring, and training services that are geared towards the development of management skills, enabling minority entrepreneurs to obtain financing and or contracts that support job creation or job preservation. And this is important because we know from the data that minority-owned businesses are more likely to hire minorities, people of color. And so by strengthening these businesses within cities, that provides another door of opportunity for having a broader effect on employment outcomes. Running out of time. So these programs, the goal is that minority entrepreneurs would experience increased competitiveness and profitability. They would start up more businesses in their communities. They would have higher survival rates and break out into new markets with higher growth. So through the 10 cities that operate entrepreneurship centers, or urban league entrepreneurship centers, there was a total of over 8,000 business owners who were served. And these services help these entrepreneurs to create or save about 5,400 jobs in their communities and get over $25 million in new contracts and financing. The example I want to cite on that is Cincinnati, Ohio. They really have a top-of-the-line model for implementing this entrepreneurship program model. And that's because they have specific components of their program that are targeted specifically to Latino entrepreneurs, African-American entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and then the affiliate itself has an entrepreneurial endeavor that employs people. And I think that's really a creative model for thinking about how a typical or a traditional workforce development agency has sort of shifted and actually becoming an employer itself. It operates a call center, customer service call center, jobs that we know are commonly, being shipped overseas. But they've partnered with a nationally recognized firm in that industry to provide training for people and actually provide jobs. And they currently have a contract with Kroger, grocery store, to provide these call center services. They currently employ about 20 people, but they're expecting within the next 2 years to expand that to about 150. And then some other examples. A colleague of mine, Jessica Gordon-Nimhard, has done a lot of work looking at community co-ops. And again, having the community take ownership in a business that they benefit from, both in terms of the revenue as well as employment. I know I'm out of time. There are so many other things that I could talk about. If we have a few minutes, I don't know, to take any questions. Okay. Okay, all right. So with that, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. First of all, again, this issue of employment disparities is much bigger than any one fix. It really does take everybody doing their part to address it. There's only so far we can go with addressing some of the tangible targets that I discussed. That includes education and job training, transportation, disparities in terms of incarceration rates, and even differences in terms of people's access through their networks. But the solution isn't, just about doing something, and it's not just about talking about it. I think the two of those are critical in terms of really making progress. And local areas really provide a lab for trying some creative things where you don't have all the layers that have to be worked through at the federal level. And if they're successful, there's opportunities to expand them, to get federal funding to begin to expand and replicate those things across the country. So I think there's opportunity here. I think there is definitely things that can be done, but it will be an ongoing process. As you know, it's not going to be solved in a year, 2 years, maybe even 5 years. But I commend you again for taking this issue on head on, being bold enough to face the realities of what's going on in this city, and to be willing to take the next step to look at what you can do about it. So thank you very much, and it has been my pleasure being here today. Thank you.